Culture industries and certain academic circles in the United States have often privileged a particular understanding of contemporary Mexican music, one in which cosmopolitan leanings are often ignored, dismissed as failed attempts to imitate the modern experimentation of American musicians, or understood as the outcome of cultural imperialism threatening an authentic Mexican identity. When contemporary music from Mexico enters the realm of American culture, it often undergoes a process of Latinization, which is also problematic, since the musicians who make up the rock and electronic scenes in Mexico seldom think of their work in racialized or essentialist terms. Such limited understanding of contemporary Mexican culture prevents us from understanding the role that rock and Mexican alternative cultures have played in recent Mexican history, and the complex and competing understandings of the role of pop and mass culture in Mexico. In its beginnings, the Mexican rock scene was mostly made up by bands that played covers of American rock songs translated into Spanish. Most bands were based in the Mexican capital. Los Locos del Ritmo, Los Tin Tops, Los Black Jeans, Los Rebeldes del Rock were all from Mexico City. Rock and roll was everywhere, in the cafés cantantes, or places where youth gathered to hear live bands in which the police often raided, in jukeboxes found in American-style cafeterias, on the radio, and even on television. Modernity had arrived. Rock and roll music was embraced by the Mexican middle class during the late 1950s as a symbol of modernization, as the economy grew and the nation underwent a rapid process of urbanization. While Mexico City dominated the Mexican rock market, bands such as Los Jets, Los Hooligan, Los Rockin' Devils, and Los Abson Boys all originated in the northern border regions of Sonora and Baja California, and their proximity to the United States allowed them a quick access to records and styles emerging in the American rock world, and permitted the bands to access American recording studios. But the geographic proximity to the United States also provided the opportunity for interesting cross-cultural processes. For instance, Los Jets, a band based in Nogales, Sonora, invited an African-American singer from Nogales, Arizona to participate as a member of the band. In transcultural manifestations such as this one, we can already get a glimpse of the dynamics that the Mexican state would find problematic. Once rock and roll music fused with different cultural trends in literature, art, and political activism, it served as a platform from which to openly challenge the official discourse of nationalism and Mexican identity. Yo no soy un rebelde sin causa. The binational character of rock music was not limited to the border areas. In 1958, the band Pepe y sus Locos won first place in the Mexican television show La Hora Internacional del Aficionado. Their prize was a trip to New York City to compete in the original amateur hour hosted by American TV personality Ted Mack. They won second place and returned to Mexico, where they renamed the band Los Locos del Ritmo. Rock music underwent an interesting transformation from a symbol of urban middle-class modernization to a genre that was perceived by the Mexican state as a potential destabilizing force. Importing a model of capitalist modernization was acceptable to the Mexican state. However, the importation of cultural trends that emerged from within such a system made state officials nervous. More problematic was the materialization of a common popular and consumer culture shared by young people from different ethnic and social extractions. The anthropologist Roger Bartra has written at length about the development and function of Mexican nationalism during the 70-year one-party rule of the Institutional Revolutionary Party. According to Bartra, it is not possible to understand the succession of post-revolutionary governments in Mexico without studying revolutionary nationalism, and he sees nationalism as contributing to legitimate the authoritarian political system. For Bartra, nationalism in general serves to establish a structural relationship between the nature of culture and the particularities of a political system. In the Mexican case, the state was required to reunify the nation, so to speak, once the revolution that began in 1910 drew to a close around 1920. The victorious faction of the Revolutionary War opted to modernize the country's economy along capitalist lines. But the introduction of social reforms of varying radicalism also incorporated the labor and agrarian sectors into the so-called institutionalized revolution. To adapt to the demands of rapid industrialization and the requirements of a mass society, it became necessary for the state to induce the modernization of the national culture as well. According to Bartra, the nationalist myth, which the official party referred to as revolutionary nationalism, was inserted into Mexican society in a paradoxical way. On the one hand, nationalism helped to stabilize the system, but it also exalted inefficiency and expressed distrust of modernization. A backlash against PRI hegemony had already begun to form since the 1950s. Workers, peasants, intellectuals, and artists all denounced and opposed the authoritarian nature of the regime. These are also some of the most vibrant years in terms of cultural production and labor struggles of the post-revolutionary era. But the pivotal moment in Mexican political history of the second half of the 20th century came in the year of 1968. In order to understand the middle-class student revolt that took place in 1968, it is important to recognize its connections to a global youth culture that questioned the post-World War II social and economic order. The student movement of 1968 developed tactics similar to those used by students in Paris, Berkeley, or Prague. And while rock did not play a central role in the student movement in Mexico as it did in the anti-war movement in the United States, it was a point of reference for many of its participants. By the late 1960s, the attitudes and cultural preferences cultivated by middle-class urban youth in Mexico City had become a topic of public debate. Elements such as rock music, a growing interest in beatnik and existentialist literature, and urban jargon that made use of words most commonly associated with criminal subcultures and northern regions, new fashions that stood in sharp contrast to those of mainstream society, and a growing interest in psychedelic drugs all composed a cultural movement that was given the name of La Onda. La Onda was closely associated with particular literary styles that addressed the rapid transformations occurring in Mexican society, and its most well-known proponents were José Agustín, Parménides García Saldaña, and Gustavo Sáenz. Since La Onda was not a cohesive movement, assessing whether it revolved around a type of identity politics or whether it was an apolitical cultural movement is difficult. It is also not easy to resolve whether La Onda can be described as part of a counterculture, that is, as a movement that tried to counter or balance the most harmful or authoritarian aspects of dominant culture and which can be better understood as derivative of a historical and class-specific American counterculture, or whether it constituted part of an underground culture that functioned in parallel to mainstream Mexican culture. However, its forms of protest were not located in political organization around issues of class. Instead, La Onda focused on personal freedom and cultural expression. The writer José Agustín often made references to popular culture and rock while exposing the contradictions of middle-class morality and the apparent stability of Mexican society.
Hemos sido tolerantes hasta excesos criticados, pero todo tiene un límite y no podemos permitir ya que se siga quebrantando irremisiblemente el orden jurídico como a los ojos de todo mundo ha venido sucediendo.
In the end, the students paid a high price for their rebellion. The festive and creative energy of the student movement was crushed with a level of violence never before experienced by the middle class.
Hoy, 12 de octubre de 1968, declaro inaugurados los Juegos Olímpicos de México, que conmemoran la 19ª Olimpiada de la era moderna.
Mexico City, thankfully a city of peace on the Olympic opening day.
The Mexican state was unwilling to negotiate at a moment when President Díaz Ordaz wanted to prove to the world that the Olympic Games of 1968 would be hosted by a nation in complete order. On October 2nd of 1968, only 10 days before the opening ceremonies for the Olympic Games, the army opened fire against a student gathering at the Plaza de las Tres Culturas in Tlatelolco. A period of brutal police repression known as the Dirty War followed the massacre. The response of the Mexican state towards the student movement was so shocking and unexpected that those who were not politically radicalized turned to the underground and counterculture as an outlet for their disillusionment with the political system. The Zona Rosa of Mexico City became a meeting ground for known writers, musicians, celebrities, and young honderos. La Onda had become a commercially viable mode of marketing fashion and goods aimed at younger consumers. Rock music and the counterculture had become the preferred modes of expression for a generation that ceased to expect political reforms after the massacre of Tlatelolco. The student movement and a generalized revolt that began within the middle classes eventually brought less affluent participants into spaces previously off-limits to them. The Mexican state, suspicious of youth movements of any sort, intensified the suppression of cultural forms of expression associated with the Mexican counterculture. For the middle classes, the counterculture was still based on the American model. At this point, most bands still sang in English. However, a debate over language had started among critics and rock musicians. The writers José Agustín and Parménides Saldaña argued that rock had to acquire a local identity through language. Soon, rock identities would be delinked from the English language. Bands such as Los Duk Duks, La División del Norte, La Revolución de Emiliano Zapata, and Three Souls in My Mind would shift to singing in Spanish. But the line between the underground and the commercial mainstream was already blurred. On September 11, 1971, the first rock festival in the history of Latin America took place in Valle del Bravo, near Mexico City. With heavy commercial support, the Festival Avándaro de Rock y Ruedas brought 22 bands to a crowd of 200,000 fans. Both the organizers and state officials were concerned that such large concentration of young people could turn into a political rally, particularly with the massacre of Tlatelolco still fresh in the minds of the participants. The state made its presence unavoidable, with a presence of over 1,000 soldiers. The image of a young woman taking her clothes off would result in the confiscation of most of the material filmed during the festival. Drugs, nudity, and perceived disorder became the focus of the media during the festival of Avándaro. Avándaro resulted in the complete silencing of rock music for the rest of the decade, and its legacy was the complete absence of Mexican rock from the airwaves until the 1980s.
No volveré, no volveré a tu lado otra vez.
Asunción le dejo aquí mi corazón, amaría toda mi alegría.
Rock music did not disappear, and bands followed the global developments of the music. Rock was reclaimed by some of the most marginal members of urban society, the sons and daughters of rural migrants who populated the growing peripheries of cities like DF and Guadalajara. By the early 1980s, the Mexican miracle was over, and the system based on patronage, corruption, and violence that the PRI had so elegantly weaved together was coming undone. An economic crisis exploded in 1982, and the response came from the technocratic elites from within the PRI. They proposed a new way of making politics. A new moment of modernization had arrived. The state could no longer deliver to the working classes, nor absorb all of the populations being displaced as a result of the early stages of neoliberal globalization. Rock was reclaimed by the working classes, and the only spaces available for its diffusion became poorly equipped marginal spaces at the peripheries of hip neighborhoods where rock had once developed. These spaces were known as hoyos funky, and they were poorly equipped, often dangerous, and improvised. Another important space that opened was the Tianguis Cultural del Chopo, a public space in which music fans were able to trade music and listen to the representatives of genres such as punk, post-punk, blues, and goth music. The anthropologist Nestor Garcia Canclini has argued that rituals come out of failed attempts at the artistic rupture of the avant-garde. Thus, through rituals such as those employed by the participants of the Mexican counterculture, new or unaccepted forms of expression are validated by society, and society validates itself. The development of the Mexican underground music scene represents a rupture with the values associated with official nationalism. During the 1980s, a movement known as the Movimiento Rupestre and singers like Jaime Lopez and Rodrigo Gonzalez conceptualized a form of folk rock that paid close attention to the local urban geography, particularly in Mexico City. Around 1981, the group's size blurred the lines between punk and new wave, and eventually some of its members formed Casino Shanghai, an early synth-pop project. Through the mid-1980s, groups like Rebelde Punk, Atóxico, and Masacre 68 made up a very politicized hardcore working-class punk scene that would influence many musicians down the line. By the late 1980s, progressive rock, new wave, post-punk, industrial, and goth, inspired by bands such as Talking Heads, Siouxsie and the Banshees, The Cure, and Front 242, also developed in Mexico. Another interesting area is the relationship between Mexican musicians from both sides of the Mexico-US border and the assumptions about Mexican music often found in the United States. We now turn to Sandra Velázquez, frontwoman of the band Pistolera based in Brooklyn, to provide us with her understanding of some of the different perceptions around music from both sides of the border.
My name is Sandra Velázquez, and I am the leader of the band Pistolera based in Brooklyn, New York. And I moved to New York in 1999, and I formed Pistolera a couple years later because I was really missing the sounds of, I guess, my home, which is San Diego, California. And my parents are Mexican, and I grew up in San Diego, about 10 minutes from the border. So I grew up listening to a lot of just various styles of Mexican music, and as well as American rock. So when I moved to New York, I realized that I really missed a lot of the sounds that I was so used to hearing all over the place, whether it was a car driving down the street, or whether it was my parents' living room, or the taco stand on the corner. So I really felt like I wanted to recreate that sound here in New York. And I also felt that it was lacking, not just outside in the world, but also in just bands here in New York City. There just wasn't anybody that was doing that, mixing Mexican music with rock. So that's why I started Pistolera, and I think that that's one of the reasons that the band has been successful, is because there's not really that many people doing that here yet. Whereas on the West Coast, you have more bands that are doing that, because you have a lot of people like me who are first generation Mexican American, who grew up listening to their parents' music as well as American rock and roll, and they go on to form bands that fuse both of those sounds. Well, you know, it's interesting because for me, because I live here in the United States and New York City, I'm trying to recreate sounds from my past, whereas I feel that some of the bands in Mexico City or in Mexico are trying to recreate sounds from here. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting because, you know, for example, we just played a show with a band from Mexico called Awesome TV, and their sound was very much of that of American indie rock, but yet they were the band from Mexico. And then we went on, and we're the band from the United States, and we're singing it completely in Spanish, and we're using sounds from Mexico. You know, we're playing cumbia, and we're playing, you know, ranchera, and so that's kind of interesting, you know, that the band from the United States is playing the Mexican music, and the band from Mexico is playing, you know, American indie rock.
Sandra Velázquez points to an interesting feature of present-day Mexican music produced in the United States. While rock and electronic musicians in Mexico are more likely to acknowledge the influence of bands like Joy Division, New Order, The Cure, Kraftwerk, Depeche Mode, or the Ramones, and oftentimes feel a closer connection to bands from Britain, the United States, Iceland, or Germany, than to music genres like cumbia or norteña, US-based bands such as Pistolera have developed an interest in reincorporating traditional Mexican music into their creative process. Moreover, the true mass media stars of Mexican music, the ones who actually live the life of rock stars, are the gruperos and norteña singers associated with traditional Mexican music. However, these musicians have enormous followings in the United States, and many of them, as in the cases of Los Tigres del Norte, Lupillo Rivera, or the musicians associated with the Pasito Duranguense, are actually residents of the United States and not Mexico. Such dynamics introduce a different set of tensions and competing interpretations of what exactly constitutes cultural authenticity or Mexican identity. While a term like rock en español does not properly describe most of the work of musicians from Mexico, nor from the United States, the term functions as a mediating mechanism that American audiences can use as a point of reference. However, the term is also a normalizing mechanism used by Latino and cultural brokers in the United States accustomed to niche markets conceptualized in terms of race and ethnicity. The geographic proximity between Mexico and the United States, the vast presence of American pop culture on Mexico's media, and constant interaction between citizens from both nations, combined with the presence of mostly international, alternative, and indie rock on stations in Mexico City such as Rock 101 and Radioactivo during the 1990s, and presently on Reactor or Ibero 90.9, have contributed to the re-emergence of rock en inglés made in Mexico.
Wake up, the sun is out. Been watching TV, don't bring the morning on. Oh no, and cartoons is in the bedroom. They just a blue.
During the late 1980s and 1990s, rock and electronic music in Mexico began to gain acceptance in ways unimaginable during the 1970s. Bands such as Caifanes, Café Tacuba, and Santa Sabina gained spaces on radio and television, and well-equipped venues opened their doors to national and international acts. As far as electronic music, already in the early 1980s, musicians influenced by bands such as Kraftwerk developed styles closely associated with German electronic music and British synth-pop. However, spaces in the media were still limited. This is a clip of the song Sexy Bodies by Casino Shanghai, an early synth-pop group from the 1980s.
No, es peligroso.
Some people call it the happiest place on earth. Others say it's a dangerous place. It has been the city of sin.
In the northern city of Tijuana, something similar took shape during the 1980s. Genres like industrial, goth, and early techno coexisted with rock. Eventually, the city of Tijuana gave birth to one of the most significant musical movements to emerge from the Mexican border. Nortec began as a musical experiment that combined elements of northern Mexican and electronic music, but it has developed into an entire border aesthetic. Tijuana has had an electronic music scene that dates back to the early 1980s, but it was in 1999 when musician Pepe Mogt, also known as Fusible, thought about translating the traditional rhythms of northern Mexican music into the field of electronica. He invited several of Tijuana's most creative musicians and producers to participate in the experiment, which another musician, Roberto Mendoza, also known as Panoptica, baptized as Nortec. Nortec signified the interiorization of the popular through a globalized optic. The Nortec Collective enlisted the participation of a group of graphic and multimedia artists to accompany the Nortec sound. These artists provided an ambiguous visual pop aesthetic composed of iconographic elements from Mexico's northern cultures. It was through this reappropriation of stereotypes and simulated otherness that the world met what was destined to become one of the most significant cultural movements from the northern Mexican border.